It's Lily Amanda for Portrait Creatives. In this episode, we are going to talk about what's the difference between opacity and flow. This can be very confusing for beginners. If you don't know what it means, you don't know how to use it. So in this episode, we are going to talk about what are the uses of these two different things and how do you use them and when to use them. For skin retouching, I think they are very different tools. I would say flow is more for speed. If you want to really retouch really fast and you have a lot of experience and you want to retouch fast, flow is definitely the way to go. Opacity is gradually to build up the effect. So it's very safe to use, and if you have any mistake, it's easy to correct as well. Think about opacity is when a painter wants to paint a painting, acrylic painting. Opacity is like thin down the acrylic paint with water. For example, if it's 10%, that means it's 10% of acrylic paint, 90% of water. If it's 20%, that means we mix 20% of acrylic paint with 80% of water. So thin it really right down. And how we gradually to build the process, the effect is multiple layers of paint. We have to paint 20% of the paint and wait for it dry and paint another layer, eventually, gradually, to build up the effect we want. That is a very slow process to go to. But in Photoshop, it's much easier. You don't have to wait for the paint to dry. You can apply to the next coat immediately without waiting for it, okay? That's the beauty of Photoshop. But now sometimes I feel a lot of us, we take it for granted of this magnificent tool to help us generate so many fantastic, amazing images. Let's get back to flow. Think about flow is actually airbrush paint. Have you ever used those cans of paint that you just spray them? Think about flow is like spray paint. It depends on how much you press it down, how much paint coming out, right? And if you go over a few times the same area, start to gradually build up all full color, right? The 100% of the color, whatever you choose. For example, if we choose to use 20% of flow, that means just press down 20% of the spray paint and paint it over. It's very easy. Just build out the process. If you just hold it and keep painting over, it will be really quick to build up the 100% of paint, the full cover for the surface. Okay, so that's just flow. That's exactly the same in Photoshop flow, how it works. Usually with flow, people will use 5-8% to do the skin retouching. And with opacity, very often it's 20 or 30%. So it really depends on what you use, what you're comfortable with. And most important thing is to try them out. Then you will see the difference in which one you decide to work. And I have worked with opacity for years and years and get very used to the tool. That means I have a lot of practice with that tool, particular tool. I'm very good at using it. It's the same with flow. Some people are just very, very good at using flow because that coordinate with their brain and how they work. They feel flow is much easier to use than opacity. Different tool actually designed for different artists, and different way of using the tool means you have different way of express yourself. And that's very important. Individually, we need to find out the tool that is suitable for us, for our brain, how we think, how we function. And Photoshop is such a powerful software. And there's no just a single way to achieve an effect. There's always multiple ways. It is built for artists have a different type of brain, different way of thinking. So they build tools like to suitable for all type of artists to achieve the result they want. So do remember this. If you feel like opacity doesn't make sense to you and flow makes sense to you, go and use flow. It's just that easy. It's the same the other way around. I understand flow, but I just feel it doesn't really work with how I feel that's most effective to retouch an image. So I choose opacity. And they both can achieve great stunning results. So it's entirely up to you. I'm going ahead to take you into Photoshop so I can demonstrate to you what I mean. So this image is beautiful, Christine, and I have used this image to demonstrate how to remove the under eye dark circles. That's in another video. I will leave the link in the description. I just did her left eye, so I'm going to carry on to do her right eye so I can show you what is the difference between opacity and flow. There's no right or wrong to do which tool. It depends on how you like it. Let me just use a mouse. The keyboard shortcut is with opacity change, you just have to press numbers. For example, I press 3 is 30%, 2 is 20%. And with flow is you have to hold on shift key and the number. And I hold on shift 3, that means 30%. Shift 5 is flow for 50%. But now I'm going back to flow 100, it's shift 0. So I'm just add a new layer with a white background. I'm going to paint with 20% opacity. So I'm just gonna paint over. I haven't released my mouse, okay? I keep hold on my mouse. I'm not releasing it. So this is 20%. So now I release my mouse, okay? And then I'm going to paint another coat, this first coat. And if we dry, I'm gonna paint the next one. You can see the ones I paint over is darker, right? The one wasn't on the first coat is only 20%. So that's opacity. Now we're gonna try flow. I'm gonna change opacity back to 100. So that's 0. Flow is a shift 20%, okay? And now I'm going to paint with my mouse, just with the flow. You can see how quickly it is to build up the paint to become like 100%, right? I haven't released my mouse yet, and it keeps adding the paint. Okay, so this is airbrush paint. Very quickly, gradually, you can build up 100%. Like this is 100% already. Just a few strokes of 20%. With opacity 20, to build up like flow, it takes much longer time. So that also means with opacity, you can do it more slowly and you will see the effect before it's over retouched or going overboard. And with flow, you have to be quite careful. Usually I will go to like even 5 or 8% to paint because it builds up so quickly. With opacity, I'm changing back to opacity, 20% opacity. If I want to gradually to have 100% of the effect, I have to lift my mouse up every time I brush it. It's like I'm waiting for the coat to dry before I paint it again, like that. So it really would take me much longer time to build up 100%. Okay, so you get the gesture, like how do you like to retouch your image. If you know what you're doing, you only need a few strokes and you know precisely where it is, then you can use flow. But if you want to be more careful about the details, and I think opacity is a very slow, gradual process, it would be easier to see the mistake before it's too late. Okay? But we always have this history you can go back to. It doesn't matter which one you use. That's just a demonstration of opacity and flow. And let me take you to the image right now to see how this works in actual skin retouching. I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to use close stamp tool and opacity 20 and flow is 100. Now I want to just lighten up her under eye dark circle. So I'm just sample this area and then drag it up, okay, like this. And I can show you before and after. And of course, I will use a layer mask to remove this area, okay? But you will see it's lighten up whole area, okay? And then I just add a layer mask and then just paint over with 100% of black brush. I will need to use 20% of brush, just paint a little bit under it because this is the shape of her eye. So definitely this one is a little bit, with a little bit shadow to look more realistic. Okay, it's like this side, it's the same. So that's before, that's after. Okay, so that just brighten up her under eye dark circle. And the same, I'm going to use the close stamp tool and with opacity of 100 and flow is 8. And then I'm going to sample this area and then I'm just going to paint over here, okay, without releasing my mouse. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. I need to zoom out to have a look at this area. I need to paint this area. And then the same, I'm going to bring back the details like here, the eye shape area. So I'm not so happy with underneath here. That just means that is too bright. So I'm going to change my opacity to 80% So you'll see underneath and here, I will blend it much better. So this one is flow, this one is opacity. They both can do the job really well, but it all just depends on which tool you like to use. This one is flow, this one is opacity. Now you know the differences between opacity and flow for skin retouching, then you can go ahead to just try them out yourself and to see which one works the best for you. And of course, you can use them both in different occasions. It depends on what you really like. And the last thing I want to demonstrate to you is that if you want to do a contouring, for example, let me just add a new curve adjustment layer. For example, I said I want to darken her face, the edge of the face. I'll just drag this one down to darken the image, and then I invert the layer mask, come on eye. And then I'm going to use the opacity, and let me just drag it right down, like super, super dark, so you can see the effect much quicker. And let's say if I use opacity 20%, and I'm not letting go of my mouse, and I just go over. And I know this is all 20% for sure. For sure, this is 20%, right? I'm not gonna make any mistake. And the second layer, I think this is just too bright. I'm going to particularly darken up this area, like that. So I know I'm not going overboard with this tool, even I just go back and forth, right? That's opacity. Let me just add another curve adjustment, and the same, and drag it all down. And I use invert, Command I to invert the layer mask. And then I'm going to use flow. Opacity 0, okay, and flow, let's say 20%. And you will see I will have to be so careful with this. Okay, if I think I can't go over it twice because it's become too dark. But if you do it very quick, for example, you just want to do a quick retouching and just go over it, then you can do it. But for example, like if I just want to darken this area a little bit dark, I just go over, right? And the place like this, then it's too dark over here already because I went over it so many times. For example, if I want to darken this area and I feel, oh, I missed this part, can I come back here? I will have to be very careful not to overlap the area. Otherwise, the overlap part would be just too dark. For example, I just did this part and I feel, okay, I'm gonna come back to do this. And I want to come back to do this part, but then the ones in between join this part, I mean this part and this part, you have to be super careful. Otherwise, you will overlap, you will make this area even darker, or it's not dark enough. Like right now, it's not dark enough. I'm not touching it because I feel I'm going to overlap it. Okay, I hope you understand what I'm saying. So this is just the last things to demonstrate to you what is different between opacity and flow. And that's the very reason I will use opacity for contouring the face or the body, or adding highlights and shadow. I use opacity because that's much easier to control the area. And so I will not overlap the area to make certain area too bright or too dark. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you find a value out of it, please give it a thumbs up. And we will be uploading more helpful tutorials. So make sure you subscribe to our channel. And I will see you in the next video.